We're going to chat about that journey through the revolutionary ways in which Archology Systems is tackling climate tech, climate change, and they're doing that by greening cities, mitigating urban heat, and bringing nature back into the city. We're going to dig deeper together into Daniel's experience and expertise and try and draw some of those key learnings that you can take away from his experience. Before I kick off, though, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and emerging. Thanks to all of you who've decided to join this conversation. I'd like to take this opportunity as well to tell you quickly about the Climate Tech Commercialisation Workshop, which is coming up on the 4th and 5th of July. This is a pilot program that's proudly been funded by the New South Wales Government in association with us at Cicada Innovations under the Net Zero Plan Stage 1. The program is a 2-day workshop where we take you through the fundamentals of building a climate tech business, and it's tailored for highly technical innovations. So if you're interested, I can tell you a little bit more about that program towards the end. But right now, let's get into our chat with Daniel. Welcome, Daniel.
Hello. Hi, everyone. How are you?
Daniel, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and why you started Archology?
Sure. I'm formally trained as an architect and worked in some of Australia's leading firms, such as Hassel, and was a design architect there, delivering the ICC Theatre, that's the Grey Theatre in Darling Harbour, and other projects. And in that space, or in that practice, I was working at the intersection between landscape architecture, urban design, and architecture. And I tried to push some very strong and progressive sustainability projects through that. And then eventually I got an opportunity to deliver one of these crazy harebrained ideas that I've been discussing for years. And so now we've been in R&D for a very long time to try and bring these concepts to reality, because it's all very good and well to say that we can create novel ecosystems on the side of a building, but in actual reality, that's very difficult to do.
So tell us a little bit more about these novel, ecosystems on the side of business. Explain to us the technology.
Yeah, so it's a new typology of vertical greening systems. So green walls or green facades. The point of difference is that it synthesizes architectural elements and vertical greening elements to complement each other to support a greater diversity of species, so greater biodiversity, but also to mitigate the pressures on vertical greening systems from very harsh urban environments.
So, sorry, go ahead, keep going.
Oh yeah, So the point of difference for our systems is that the vertical greening is rotated 90 degrees, and it forms a porous structure that can go over existing buildings and allow for visual transparency from the inside, which is something that our customers have expressed as a desire. And also creates porosity. So it's custom designed to create habitat corridors for migrating species to move between habitat islands, and therefore increase the genetic diversity from those habitat islands in urban areas.
And you also mentioned that this helps to reduce urban heat islands. So in terms of a climate change solution, tell us a little bit more of how this impacts that.
Yeah, so the hydrological design of the system moves the water down through plant growing media, which you'll see on the right hand side image, which is sheltered from the sun and from hot winds to maintain efficient water flows and water security, which we control through a whole series of very fine sensors. And that water security allows for very high performance of evapotranspiration and the evapotranspiration potential of our systems would theoretically reduce the urban temperature surrounding the building by 4 degrees. But not only that, the system itself acts as a thermal shade over the building or the host building structure, and that reduces 79% of the thermal load on the host building, and that results in a 40% reduction in building cooling emissions. So that's quite significant. In a case study we looked at at Westmead Public Hospital, that would result in a 2.9 million tonne reduction per year just for that hospital.
That's incredible, Daniel. I mean, there's kinds of savings in cooling efficacy and emissions. Just, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned earlier that you started out as an architect and now you are the founder of this startup. How did you, I guess, navigate that transition? Because what you're putting here in front of us is such an immense solution, and it requires, we're going to dig into a little bit about the how do you get something as big as this off the ground. But what was it that made you move from being an architect to being a founder of a climate tech company?
I think a lot of it came around from the opportunity of the first customer who wanted to have one of these systems on one of his buildings. And then in the process of designing that, we realized that there weren't enough products in the market to actually produce what we wanted in terms of something that was porous, had long longevity, and would create habitat, so it had the right amount of habitat infrastructure. And during that process, we realized that we would have to develop our own systems. And then that was a major departure point from my architectural practice into 6 years of research into how to actually create these novel ecosystems.
And what was it like in those 6 years, those first 6 years of research, where you're kind of leaving behind one world and entering into another world?
Yeah, I am still entering. I am very much not, I guess, a classic startup person, or I had never imagined that I was in a startup. It was only probably until 6 months before the Elevate program that I realized that we were running a startup, and that transition between coming from a designer to being a researcher into being, I guess, an entrepreneur has been quite difficult, but a very rewarding journey.
Yeah, you also mentioned that this kind of came about because you had the pull from a first customer. And now looking at your solution as it's evolved, tell us how that conversation with your first customer went. What were the things that they were trying to solve and that you felt you could solve with this solution?
Yeah, so the first customer had a steep sloping site, waterfront site near a national park in a remnant and Gofra forest. And the bulk of the building mass, because of the steep sloping site, pushed the building up into the sight lines of the neighbours who were quite wealthy. And then we had a lengthy court battle. And so our intention was to create the building as an extension of the landscape, so that it bled into the landscape. And during that year-long court battle, I won't get into it, but at one point the commissioner was like, "Oh, you can't." We even took a commissioner out into a boat to show him the site from the water and the impact our building would have, and he was like, "Oh, you can't see it." And then at that point, the neighbours kind of capitulated. And so I guess that's one of the driving factors of these solutions, is that they can help building owners or developers create buildings or pieces of architecture or developments that support the urban environment or the landscape environment. And so from a sustainability point of view, I think that the value is that we're able to assist them move through this emerging regulatory environment that's gaining momentum. For instance, in Melbourne, they've just recently introduced the Green Factor score, which puts pressure on developers to achieve a certain amount of urban greening. And they're following the lead of what's happening with Singapore, where the equivalent of the site area is required as vegetative cover over the building. So there's a real strong push from a regulatory point of view to achieve this urban greening.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because there are continuously imposed targets on different areas of industry, different businesses. We see government, even with this net zero plan, trying to encourage as much as possible through policy that we're doing the right things with regards to sustainability, with regards to urban, I guess, regeneration of nature as well. But a solution like that, like something in the construction industry or the development industry, it requires an immense, solution. And when I look at your facade, it's beautiful, but it is huge and it's large. So talk us through around, how did you and your team come to the, I guess, the plan to put something like this into action, from research to, all right, we're going to make one of these now. And what did that look like?
Yeah, okay. So we'd gone through and developed our MVP, and then through that process and talking to customers, we discovered that there were further or additional requirements. And then through the testing, because it takes a long time for us to test these systems. I mean, 6 years of research, and that's because we're moving at the pace of plant growth. In some cases, it takes 3 years for an indicator plant to tell us that we've got the right geometry that impacts the airflow, water flow, and all the other conditions. So after the MVP, we applied for a City of City demonstration pavilion grant to demonstrate the technology, and that was really the catalyst for us to progress that that pathway. And then recently, I've just come back from the meeting with Wholesome, where that both Wholesome Global Group and Wholesome Australia have a 2025 accelerating green growth agenda, where they're pivoting their company from concrete and aggregates to developing sustainable building solutions, and they want to be the leaders of sustainable building solutions. So the most daunting part is that we had, I guess, an intention of having a small scale facade business with fairly humble ambitions, and then we got contacted from the executives at Wholesome Global Group, and now we're talking about going into partnership for large scale manufacturing and delivery of these systems for whole cities. So I'm still trying to grapple with what that means, but my hands are sweating.
It's true, isn't it? Because, climate is such an important and critical topic for so many businesses. And while, in the startup world, there are great solutions coming out, it's really difficult to know where that's going to end up when it comes to being implemented in industry, right? You may think, like you say, that we're going to start doing and building this ourselves as a humble facade builder, but all of a sudden we're in discussions with global multinationals about this. Tell us then, you said, I just want to go back to the Sydney demonstrator site, the Sydney of City demonstrator site. Tell us why that was an important part of your plan in terms of being able to validate your MVP. What did that do for you? Or what is it doing for you? I know you're still going through it. So tell us a little bit about why you felt it was important to validate your MVP that way.
Yeah, I guess it was, it helped to reduce some of the perceived risk by any potential customers or clients or investors or so on, that the government was supporting these kind of agendas, and they were pushing for these new technologies. And that was really an endorsement of the technology, and a signal to the commercial operators that the government would be supporting that. And then we recently worked on another SBIR program for the Office of Chief Scientist and Engineer and the Greater Cities Commission to look at dealing with urban heat in Westmead Health and Innovation District. And then once again, even in the meeting today, we were talking to the executive general manager and the other executive heads about the potential of our system, and having that government endorsement of what we're doing, I think really helped to reassure them that there was a signal from the market that this was happening, because there's obviously signals from the market from a customer's demand point of view. But as we said, with regulatory frameworks, that really has to be pushed from a governmental point of view, so that the squeeze is on the people in the middle who have to deliver.
So that's really interesting, because it's a balance between building trust and credibility in the market, leveraging or taking those cues from those market signals, and then balancing the regulatory requirements, kind of bringing that all together so that you're able to put some credibility around your MVP, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you've just come out of literally hot out of this meeting with Holcim's executive team, and I want to understand from you how you're feeling about what partnerships like this can do between startups and industry and government. What do these partnerships do for climate tech companies like yourself?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question, and I think that talking about the SBR earlier is that with the change of government in the New South Wales government, that program became under budgetary review and has been delayed, and so I guess reliance on government grants and government leadership exposes you to a lot of vulnerability, particularly when a lot of this will be driven by commercial opportunities and large-scale corporations who have the capacity to deliver these projects.
Yeah, and that's the key, isn't it? The capacity to deliver. Because when we look at climate tech solutions, they're generally trying to solve something quite large, immense in a lot of cases. And looking at that image before of your facade on a skyscraper or a large scale building, the logistics of implementing, manufacturing and implementing, and then the regulatory requirements, and then the maintenance and servicing of that is larger than life when you think about it. So it's the capacity to deliver, isn't it?
Yeah, and also there is the urgency to deliver. Like, it's evident that climate change is happening faster than I think we had anticipated, and we're seeing increased urban heat effects out at Kemps Creek at the Aerotropolis site for Western Parkland City, where we have a test cell. It got up to 48 degrees in late April, and that's freakishly hot. And the other implication of that is that the sun angle at that time of the year is much lower and exceeds the frameworks for conventional solar shading on buildings. So regulatory frameworks and building codes are not keeping up to the changes of climate in the same way that vegetation communities and ecosystems aren't able to migrate fast enough to move into areas that are more hospitable, and that's pretty terrifying. But so talking about the Aerotropolis and the scale, the impacts of our system will only be felt when they're delivered at scale, and that is to say the scale of something like Western Sydney Parkland City. Doing a couple of buildings here and there won't do that much. It has to be done at a precinct level. So it's daunting to even think about doing a mid to large scale building, but think about doing like 5,000 of them. The capacity of doing that is beyond any startup. So that's why it was really, really interesting and encouraging to have Holcim support us. And the Chief Sustainability Officer said that this new product or system that we've developed is the future of Holcim.
So I think that's absolutely gold what you've just said there, Daniel, in the sense that, if we want to have impact, we have to deliver these things at scale. And while as a startup, you come with a great innovation and you can spend years researching that, really when you think about how do you take that to market and how do you implement it and how do you get that adopted at scale, that's a whole nother level. And so that's one of the things that we explore with startups when we're working with them through either the program or through the one-to-one coaching, right?
Yeah.
In that sense, then, knowing that delivery at scale is where impact will happen, tell us, if you think back, where were some of the pivotal moments or the breakthrough moments in your mind as you were going through the research, as you were going through, you know, your MVP and the validation of the MVP and speaking with all the policy and regulatory people and speaking to large partnerships? In that journey, where were those moments where, if you look back, you said that was a key moment? Whether it was a key moment for the good or for the pivot, like for, oh gosh, we're on the wrong track or we're on the right track. Tell us where you had some of those light bulbs.
I don't know. I might have post-traumatic amnesia because I can't recall of one straight away.
On a startup, relate to that.
Yeah, I mean, there are beautiful moments. So one moment when we're out filming for one of our recent videos, in front of the alpha prototype, there was a honey eater that was feeding off one of the flowers in our system, and that honey eater is supposed to be extinct in in the Sydney precinct.
Wow.
And it was the first time I'd seen it since I was 9 years old, when I used to live in the national park and we used to walk through the heathland scrub.
Wow.
So yeah, that's Spineville. That was to see that again was quite beautiful.
That's actually moving me. I'm having a little moment here because, you know, in able to bring back nature to the cities, and not only to bring back those that are threatened and those that you haven't seen since children. I'm sure all of us can relate to animals and insects and birds that we don't see anymore that we did see as children. Is really quite an incredible moment. Tell us then, you know, what's driving you? Because it feels like for me that that's kind of what drives you in, you know, seeing that gleaning come back. But tell us a bit more about your purpose, like your sense of purpose that drives you, because this is a tough gig, you know.
Yeah, it is a particularly tough gig in Australia as well. I think Australia, I was talking to the executive today, Australia is maybe 20 years behind, maybe more. It seems like every year we get further behind Europe and America in terms of sustainability and urban greening and so on. And so it's really tough. It's really tough. Like for years we weren't even allowed to talk about climate change. We couldn't have climate change in any presentation. Even mentioning sustainability was problematic because people see it as wishy-washy, and everything's kind of driven by commercial imperatives. So the thing that really drives me is my love for the Australian landscape.
Yeah. I share that love with you. I mean, the Australian landscape is such a key part of our identity as well as Australians. But, you know, in terms of how we want to see our future as well, it's a special place.
Yeah, and just witnessing the degradation and decline of natural ecosystems just around the city in Australia in my short lifetime, and in rewilding practice that's called, or an ecology that's called the shifting baseline. And every generation thinks back to their childhood as being the natural state, and every generation it gets worse and nature declines more. And so that's really what drives me forward, is to give wildlife a voice in our planned, built and constructed environments. I'm actually kind of a little bit of a boomer. I don't have an Instagram. I do have an Instagram post, never posted anything. And I've been several years, so been a lot of pressure on me from all of my students about what my first post would be. And sorry, I'm a bit of a sidetrack, but there's a video around of a cockatoo walking along the edge of a window, ripping up all the anti-bird nesting devices, those spikes. It's just like systematically walking along, destroying it. And I think that little cockatoo is a champion for me.
Yeah, right. And that's so interesting that I didn't really understand that, in how each generation looks back at their childhood as the norm. And so what will the current children think when they look back at their childhood as the norm? That's really something for me to meditate on tonight. Just as a kind of like wrap up, I think, you know, you're going through a tremendous journey. You're driven by a tremendous purpose. You're delivering something that is immense in its impact, but also in its scope and operations. What would you like to see happen next? Not just for Archology Systems, but for climate tech companies in the next 12, 24 months. What would you like climate tech companies to do more of?
I don't know that I could speak for climate tech companies. I don't know that I'm in a position of authority to say anything. Just survive the current economic downturn, I guess.
Yeah.
Somehow survive it. I think it's going to be really tough, particularly for startups. And we need young, passionate people who are going to come up with innovative and sustainable and commercializable solutions. And the opportunities for that in the next 12 months could be quite difficult because of the downturn. And so I just hope that they all survive and are able to get through.
What do you think is the key to survival? Where do you think opportunities are if it's not in the 12 months coming, in the next 5 years? We
Funding.
continue to drive funding. Yeah, I think that's an important one. Funding is really difficult in Australia. And we have this conversation a lot about going overseas for funding, trying to fund in Australia. And no answer is right, no answer is wrong. It's like, where is the funding? Where is the partnership that you can find to drive forward? And if you go overseas, it doesn't matter if you go overseas and come back to Australia. I know you personally have a true intention to do more in Australia, but what's your balance between the Australian international viewpoint?
We often joke amongst our team that if we were doing this in any other country, it would have been done 3 years ago, because manufacturing anything in Australia is just so difficult. And in the construction industry in particular, the construction industry is quite a laggard when it comes to digital technology and research and R&D and efficiencies and so on. So particularly in Australia or Sydney at the moment, there's just so much pressure on building efficiency, and no one will even talk to you if you want to experiment with them, because they're just 120% pumping out whatever they need to pump out, and they can't do it quick enough.
Yeah.
So we're caught between attention, and we've designed something specifically for the Australian landscape, for Australian species, both fauna and flora. And we've even designed it specifically to collect and preserve local genetic provenance species of plants that are likely to be wiped out, say, in the development of the Western Sydney Parkland Authority. And we're able to grow them on our green roofs and facade systems and so on. And then, so working with ecologists, we're realizing that some of these species or these local provenance species may only exist on our buildings. They would be completely wiped out within Sydney. And so then talking to Wholesome today and Wholesome Global about how we expand into the international market, I'm quite torn between my connection to the Australian landscape and delivering something for Australia against chasing the money and delivering projects overseas. I mean, that would take us talking to some Saudi businessmen about the Greening Riyadh project. And they said, what would it take for us to come over to Riyadh and start working with them? And I said, well, we need local people, local skills, local knowledge, local horticulturalists, ecologists, and so on. We can't just parachute this technology into anywhere. But in doing that, in chasing that and going overseas, then I'm going to not be in Australia.
Yeah. And I think that's such a key point, right? Because when you do start to scale into the global environment, it's not always a, lift and shift when it comes to a climate solution. Climate solutions can be very local in terms of their implementation.
Often are extremely localized.
Yeah. And that's a really good point for us to note. When we're building a solution here, we're building and designing for the Australian, but then as we grow, we need to think about how do we make that impact relevant as we grow outside of our shores.
Yeah, exactly. And that's quite a difficult thing to communicate to commercial entities and partners, in that it's not like buying a mobile phone or a tablet or something
Yeah,
else. You can't just like buy these things and stick them anywhere.
yeah,
And that there's further R&D to customize them to the particular sustainability requirements of a geographical region.
absolutely. Daniel, I feel like you and I could talk on and on and on, but I do want to open up the conversation to the audience today that have joined us for some questions. Let's open it up. Thanks, Daniel, for sharing. I've learned already so much. I talk to you regularly, and I still learn more from you every single day. So thank you so much for being so honest and so candid about your journey. Let's open it up to the audience and ask them if they'd like to ask you any questions. I
Sure.
feel I'm just going to ask Hella. Hella, are you going to unmute people, or shall we ask them to put their questions in the chat? I'll just read some of the comments. Julia mentioned that not all innovators are young. There are old and passionate people in this space. Daniel, we totally agree with that. Daniel's co-founder is also not of the young, but very passionate. And we see lots of older people coming through Cicada as well. But definitely, that in myself including, there's this cohort of people that have sort of done what they needed to do in their early career and are now transitioning in doing something meaningful with their later career.
And yeah, so I'm finding that a lot with a lot of people that I'm working with or networking with. There's the professional shift or vocational shift that happens later in their career. And my co-founder, I just don't know how he is able to keep going, because he's getting on. He must almost be turning 80 now, and he's still sending me messages at 5 o'clock in the morning and like emails 11 o'clock at night. So maybe there are benefits, as we get older, we don't sleep as much, so we're more suited to being startup founders.
Maybe. A comment from Anne: your work is fantastic, Daniel. Thank you for sharing your insights and experience. 100% inspirational. Thank you, Anne. And from Julia again, great variation on the international theme, and good to hear Wholesome is taking a stand. Strange that it needs to be a German investor. Well, this is it, right? It's like, where can you find the partner, the right partner above all?
Yeah. And just on that, there's also with these multinational companies, there's a tension between their local organizations or their local companies and the strategic company. And that's one of the things we're finding in Wholesome, is that the parent company is pivoting to address what they're seeing as the local demand, but the local company is a bricks and mortar company because we're 20 years behind.
Yeah. We've got a question. If you could explain more about the product. We saw the image, but can you explain a little bit more about a perfect local customer?
The perfect local customer would say be a building owner. So either a government agency or an institution, say a university, or a large scale developer that is building a commercial office park. And our strategy is about urban rewilding. So we have to build from strength. So if we were to plonk one of these, like what's happened opposite UTS with one central park in the middle of the city without connecting it to other green areas, the chances of it developing any sort of wildlife or diversity would be very slim. So our ideal customer is a customer that's located close to an existing habitat corridor or a declining habitat corridor, one that is probably an office building, so that they see the value in the reduction in energy consumption, both from a carbon point of view, but also an operational point of view. But also we have this debate quite often. Our ideal customer is probably an organization that we would never want to associate with because they have such a bad carbon record. It's honestly true. I mean,
and that's
the
point, isn't it? In trying to convert those that have the detrimental impact and trying to move them towards being part of this, regenerative story of the urban environment.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we had a lot of moral issues and like strategic issues when we were beginning to work with the Saudis, because there are just deep concerns about whether building massive green cities in the middle of the desert fed by aquifers that are depleting is sustainable or irresponsible.
Yeah, absolutely. So that connectivity is really important, isn't it? It's like trying to extend what we have existing, but also
Mm-hmm.
connecting those that are disparate and a little bit spread out, and trying to create those corridors so that you're creating that network, you're creating that connection.
Yeah, and the ideal project for us would be, say, the Westland Parkland City, but that's a whole new city that's being developed on the Cumberland Plain, in the Cumberland Plain vegetation community. Um, and so there are amazing possibilities to start that off on a good foot, as opposed to building something that is business as usual and then trying to work out how we're going to deal with the problems later, because there is an amazing amount of biodiversity just in and around that area, because it used to be agricultural land, and that agricultural land, since the rezoning of development, has basically been abandoned as developers land bank it, and so it's developed quite a rich biodiversity. So that would also be one of our key clients.
A question from Simon around funding and access to funding in Australia. His question is: given your time again, would you take it overseas first?
Uh, no, I couldn't. I don't have the knowledge or the connection with the landscape to be able to do that.
Mm.
It's really come out of spending a lot of time in the landscape studying the behaviors of animals and birds and so on.
Mm.
And working with the experts here, like the ecologists, the environmental scientists we work with, I don't think I'd be able to have the knowledge or connection to country to just like move to England and start doing it there. So as much as the funding opportunities are there, I'm connected to Australian landscape.
And I think that's important when whatever you're working on is to leverage into your strengths, your network, the people that you know. That's where you're going to get the most traction first, and then think about, it's not always about, chasing, like you say, the funding. Even when you're looking
Mm,
for investors,
mm,
I want the
yeah,
right investors going to believe in what you do, support what you do, and drive what you do. So really leveraging and leaning into your belief, what you know, who you know, how you know, and pushing that forward.
yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
Yeah. A question from Julia around how do you make sure that you don't attract too many pest species?
This is a favorite question of everyone's. Um, well, it's part of the urban rewilding strategy, which I mentioned a few times, which is about reforming trophic cascades that is the web of life, the interaction between one level of species to another level of species, basically who eats who and where the energy moves. And so you end up with pest species when you have an unstable ecosystem. So I'm sure we've all been out camping somewhere and had like terrible mozzie experience. Well, that's usually because that ecosystem where the campground is not in harmony. Um, so, for instance, with mosquitoes, we spoke to a expert in mosquitoes from New South Wales Health, who gave us some really good advice. There are two types of mosquitoes in Australia. One lays its eggs on a still water surface, and then after time that hatches, and the other one lays its eggs on the edge of the water surface, and when there's a change of water level, then it hatches. And so that's why you find less mosquitoes in areas where there's lots of running water instead of stagnant water. And so we had to engineer our bird baths to have continuous running water and tidal levels at quite a high frequency to prevent the laying of these eggs and to continue the disturbance of the water. So that's one example. The other example is through re-establishing the apex predators for the area. So we don't have any pests in our alpha prototype or the MVP in the greenhouse, and that's because a resident diamond python was made it its home. And so the pythons living in there, and they are in harmony with the water dragons and the birds and other things that are living in and around the system, but there are no rats or anything like that.
So that's really interesting because there's a whole kind of conversation you need to have with your customers around what it means now.
Yeah. Had one of those awkward conversations today, and that was the last question we had at Wholesome.
Yeah.
And people are, you would think that they would be repulsed about the idea of a diamond python living in the building they're in, but most people are kind of titillated or excited by it.
Right.
Yeah, it's a hard one. We have to like very carefully camouflage some of the language around it so it's presented in the right way, which is something we've learned out of the Elevate course about like how much information do you disclose and how can you disclose it in an appropriate way. Yeah, because that is challenging. I mean, yeah,
It's
that's
about you're shifting mindsets here. You're shifting mindsets here as well. So
yeah,
it's about how you tell the story, isn't it? And how you bring people slowly into that space with you. Because this is, like you say, not that long ago, we couldn't even speak about climate change in our presentations. We've come along, we've got a long way to go still. We're moving forward, but there's still a lot for us to absorb, isn't it? As an individual.
yeah, and that the changing mindsets is one of the key values that even Wholesome, the head of sustainability, saw in our proposal today. In that, it's about reconnecting people with nature in the urban environment when most urban dwellers are disconnected from nature, and that's causing quite large and significant and well-documented psychological problems. And that's continuing what is called the extinction experience, where people no longer value nature because they're so detached. And so that feeds into these like negative feedback loops around shifting baselines. And so our system is about encouraging people to understand and interact how ecosystems work, and therefore remove some of the fear. There's a great example that which you use from an architectural precedent, which is the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe, which is a glass box built on a floodplain. And the idea behind that is that you're inside this glass box, able to look at the dynamism and drama of this flooding landscape. But he called it safe danger because you're within the confines of something you're familiar and you know.
That's so fascinating. I'm going to look that up and read more about that. But we're at time, and so we're going to wrap up here. Daniel, it's been great to have this chat with you. We've explored a lot around this journey. There is a lot still to do. But as you said, we're shifting mindsets. We're bringing people along. We're trying to make a big impact at scale, and we need partnerships to do that, but we need the innovators out there doing that. So thank you for spending today with us. Really
thank you.
appreciate that.
I'm very happy that I'm still awake and alive to do this presentation. But thanks about.
Thank you so much. And to all of our audience that have joined us today, if you'd like to know more about the Elevate Climate Tech Workshop that we're running on the 4th and 5th of July, please don't hesitate to reach out to Cicada. We can tell you more. And we would love to see you at one of our community events. We'll sign up to our newsletter and join us one of our community events. You might even see Daniel down there once and have a chat and learn more. Thanks everybody for joining today. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks again, Daniel.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks about. See you soon.
See you, everyone. Bye.